The smell of coffee clung to my uniform that morning, not because I had time to drink it, but because one of the younger soldiers had laughed nervously and spilled his mug near the entrance to the hall. I remember watching the dark stain spread across the concrete, ordinary and harmless like any other day on base. Yet inside me, there was nothing ordinary. The sound of brass instruments warming up in the distance carried a weight that pressed against my chest. Today was supposed to be about honor ceremony, a clean line drawn across years of service. But the unease I carried felt louder than the music. My name is Captain Rachel Donovan, United States Army. I am 31 years old, logistics officer by title, soldier by instinct, daughter by obligation. For most of my life, I believed those roles could not coexist without collision. Standing in the shadow of the auditorium that morning, I knew I was right. When the doors opened and sunlight spilled across the polished floor, the world shifted. Families filed in, murmurs of excitement, echoing off the high rafters. Little kids waved miniature flags, mothers straightened ties, fathers adjusted cameras. From the outside, it looked like pride. From where I stood, it felt like theater, because I knew who was sitting in the front row. My parents, my brother, the very people who had taught me silence was safer than truth. The announcer's voice carried across the hall, each name followed by applause, each salute sharp as a blade. I adjusted the cuffs of my dress, blues feeling the fabric cling to my wrists tight, unyielding the way duty always is. When my name was called Captain Rachel Donovan, the cheer rolled like thunder. For a moment, it almost felt real. I walked forward, the stage lights catching the brass on my chest, every step rehearsed, controlled, measured. But then my eyes found his. Ethan, my older brother. He was seated directly behind my parents, slouched with that familiar defiance jaw, locked eyes burning straight into me. He hadn't worn a uniform in years, not since he was discharged in disgrace. And yet in that instant, he made the ceremony his own. My stomach tightened a chill running under my skin despite the heat of the lights. People say you can sense a storm before it breaks. I saw it in the way his fingers tapped against his knee, the way my father leaned forward ever so slightly, as though expecting a show. The crowd around them smiled, clapped, unaware. To them, it was a celebration, a daughter honored, a family reunited. To me, it was a powder keg dressed up as patriotism. I forced my smile into place, accepted the folder, extended my hand for the ritual shake. Cameras flashed, applause swelled. On the surface, it was perfect, America's image of loyalty and sacrifice. But beneath it, a truth I had carried my entire life twisted in my gut. My family had not come to celebrate me. They had come to remind me that no matter how far I ran, they could still pull me back into their storm. And as Ethan rose slowly from his seat, I knew the storm was already moving. Ethan's rise from the front row was slow enough for me to notice fast enough that no one else reacted in time. I felt the shift in the air before anything happened, the subtle dip in the crowd's applause, the pause of the band's trumpets, as if the music itself sensed something was wrong. My hand extended toward the general for the ritual exchange polished folder in one palm, the other steady for a salute. That was the moment Ethan broke the line. He moved down the aisle with the same swagger he had carried since childhood, as though space bent to let him through. One usher stepped into his path, but Ethan brushed past like he had every right to be there. Another officer reached out too late. By the time the realization spread across the first rows, he was already climbing the steps, boots echoing on the polished wood. I remember how the flag behind me stirred slightly in the air conditioning, the stars and stripes glowing under the stage lights. I remember the exact second my name, still echoing from the loudspeaker, collided with the sound of his shoes on the platform. The moment split open and the ceremony ceased to be mine. His fist came from the right, fast, merciless. A crack echoed through the microphone still clipped at the podium, sharp enough to silence the hall. Pain exploded across my cheekbone, white light flashing at the edges of my vision. My cap tore free, spinning into the front row. The folder slipped from my hand corner, striking my ribs as it fell, and suddenly the metal meant to honor me clattered on the floor like discarded change. The audience gasped as one body. Some shouted my name. Others simply froze. In that suspended silence, I heard the sharp intake of breath from young cadets standing at attention. I tasted copper on my tongue. My knees buckled. The polished floor was cold against my palms as I steadied myself. And then the blood came. Warm, thick a line from lip to chin, staining the front of my pristine dress blues. Red spreading across white, an image so stark it felt choreographed. My humiliation painted itself for every camera lens lifted in the room. I pushed upward, unwilling to collapse fully, but the world swam. The stage lights blurred the outlines of faces smeared like watercolor. Ethan loomed above me, chest heaving, shoulders squared. He wiped his knuckles against his suit trousers as if it had been nothing more than dust. The hall erupted. Commands barked. Security rushed forward. But not before my father stepped into view. Retired Colonel Robert Donovan, medals still gleaming on the chest of the suit he wore like a uniform. For a fleeting heartbeat, I thought he had moved to shield me. Instead, he bent low, his words steady and deliberate enough for only me to hear. "You deserved it." The words landed harder than the punch. They carved through the din, cold, unflinching. The man who had taught me to salute, who had once corrected my posture with gentle taps on the shoulder, now stood above me like an executioner handing down a sentence. I looked up at him through the blur in my eyes, searching for something. Hesitation, regret, even conflict. There was none. Only that same implacable pride that had carried him through decades of command, now twisted into approval of my brother's violence. Flashes exploded around us, capturing the moment from every angle. Phones lifted higher, hands trembling. I could hear the chorus ripple through the crowd, "Record this, all of it." The brass band faltered, then fell silent. In the aisles, cadets shifted, uneasily torn between discipline and outrage. I steadied myself on the stage floor, breath ragged but unbroken. My cheek throbbed with every heartbeat, but I forced myself to sit upright. A professor in uniform crouched beside me, pressing a handkerchief to my lip until it bloomed red. He whispered to stay down, but I shook my head. Staying down was what they wanted. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan standing taller, almost proud. He met the gaze of the guards as though daring them to act. My father folded his arms across his chest, a silent challenge to authority that had once been his own. And my mother clutched her program so tightly the paper crumpled, her eyes darting anywhere but toward me. The ceremony was broken beyond repair. The hall that had moments ago been filled with pride and applause now buzzed with shock and disbelief. And yet amid the chaos, I felt something harden inside me. The pain was real. The shame was heavy. But so were the cameras, the witnesses, the undeniable evidence. What was meant to destroy me had already been recorded frame by frame, turning humiliation into proof. Proof of who Ethan was, proof of what my father had chosen to protect, proof of what I had endured in silence. I rose slowly, blood staining my collar medal still lying at my feet. The applause would never return, not for me, not for them. But as I stood beneath the flag, bruised and trembling, I realized the story had already slipped from their control. And for the first time, I understood this was not the end of my ceremony. It was the beginning of my reckoning. The echo of my father's words lingered longer than the sting of Ethan's fist. "You deserved it." 3 syllables, steady and deliberate, carved into me deeper than bone. Pain can swell, bruise, fade. But those words settled in the hollow of my chest, heavy as stone. I forced myself upright, one palm against the polished wood of the stage, the other pressed to my throbbing cheek. The hall pulsed with sound shouts, from officers, gasps from strangers, the steady whir of cameras, recording what could not be undone. Yet all I could hear was his voice, calm amid chaos, like an officer issuing an order he expected to be obeyed. For one flicker of a moment, I saw him not as my father, but as the colonel the world had once revered. Shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes hard with conviction. I remembered being 6 years old, standing in our yard in Ohio, practicing salutes under his watchful eye. Again, he'd say, correcting the angle of my wrist, the line of my spine. He was relentless, but I thought it was pride. That memory split, now jagged against the truth before me. He had not come to lift me up. He had come to watch me fall. My mother sat frozen in the front row. Her hands twisted the program into a crumpled knot, her knuckles white. She did not rise, did not speak, did not meet my eyes. She had spent a lifetime shrinking into silence, smoothing edges, whispering peace into tempests. And in that moment, she disappeared entirely, as though her very body betrayed her into stillness. The betrayal was not only my father's words or Ethan's fist, it was her silence so practiced, so complete, that broke me in a quieter way. She could not save me. She would not even try. Around us, security converged, their radios crackling, voices tight with urgency. Ethan smirked, chest out, his fist still red from impact. My father stood at ease, arms folded, his eyes daring anyone to intervene. And my mother, she simply held the shredded paper in her lap like it was all she had left to control. I thought of the night she used to sit at the edge of my bed, smoothing my hair, after Ethan had slammed a door or shouted names down the hallway. She never told me he was wrong. She only whispered, "Let's just keep the peace." I wanted her to say something different now, anything that would prove she saw me, believed me. But her lips stayed pressed together, trembling, sealing her into that old role. The weight of it all pressed in. My father's judgment, my brother's violence, my mother's silence. For years I had carried the hope that somewhere under the harshness there was love, that if I proved myself enough, they might let it show. Standing under the flag, bruised and bloodied, I felt that illusion dissolve. A woman in the second row lifted her phone higher and said aloud, "Get his voice, too. Record him." I realized then that my father's words had not only cut me, they had been caught by dozens of microphones burned into the memory of every device in the room. He thought he had delivered a final verdict. In truth, he had handed me evidence. The realization steadied me more than the professor's hand on my shoulder. I straightened, ignoring the sting of blood on my collar. The silence between my mother's clenched fists and my father's cold stare was louder than any anthem that had played. They had written their part of the story in public, and now the world would see it. I lifted my eyes, not to them, but to the crowd. Some looked away uneasy. Others leaned forward, anger bright on their faces. In that sea of strangers, I saw something my family had never given me witnesses. Proof that I was not imagining, not exaggerating, not alone. For years they had told me to keep quiet, to swallow bruises, to excuse tempers, to sacrifice for the image of family. But there, under the lights, with blood marking my uniform and cameras flashing silence, was no longer mine to carry. They had shattered it themselves. And as my father stood unmoved, as my mother folded deeper into invisibility, I felt a shift within me, a line breaking, a door opening. Their betrayal was complete, and with it came a clarity I had never known. This was no longer about surviving them. It was about exposing them. What they had meant to be my humiliation would become their unmasking. The clarity I felt beneath the stage lights did not appear from nowhere. It was forged in years that had already prepared me for this exact moment, though I hadn't recognized it until now. My father's words, my mother's silence. Ethan's fist, they were not sudden betrayals. They were the culmination of a pattern that had shadowed me since childhood, each crack in the foundation leading to this collapse. I remember being 9 years old the first time Ethan shoved me hard enough to send me sprawling on the driveway. My knees split open, blood pooling on the gravel. I had looked up, waiting for my father's reprimand, certain that justice, even within a family, must mean protection. Instead, I heard his voice calm and dismissive. "Don't be dramatic, Rachel. Boys have tempers." My mother dabbed at my knees with a dish towel, whispering, "Let's just keep the peace," while Ethan strutted away unscathed. That was the template. The years blurred into variations of the same lesson. At 14, I barred Ethan from copying my homework. He slammed my door so hard the frame splintered. My father told me I should have let him. He just needs help staying on track. My mother patched the crack in the wood, her hands shaking as though the break had been in her bones, not mine. By high school, Ethan's outbursts were routine, as predictable as the seasons. Teachers called home about his fights, his late assignments, his absences. My father brushed it all aside with the same refrain, "He's a man's man. The world just doesn't understand him." I, meanwhile, was invisible. Straight A's debate trophies, scholarship letters, each one met with polite acknowledgement, then swiftly overshadowed by Ethan's chaos. The difference between us grew sharper when Ethan followed my father's path into the military. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps the structure might save him, force him into discipline. But it didn't last. He was discharged after a violent altercation, details hushed, swept aside. I remember the day he came home, rage radiating off him, throwing his duffel in the corner. My father clapped him on the shoulder like a conquering hero. "You're still a real man," he said, voice filled with pride. Pride for a son who had squandered honor. Nothing for the daughter who had quietly earned hers. It was then I knew I had to choose a different path, not to escape the family's shadow, but to define myself against it. I enlisted. Not because I thought it would earn my father's approval. By then I had stopped chasing that mirage, but because the Army offered something he could never give: structure that rewarded merit, not tantrums. A place where silence was not the only survival strategy. But even as I rose through the ranks, the wounds never truly healed. Every accolade carried the echo of his indifference. Every deployment reminded me of the nights I had spent listening to Ethan storm through our house, unchecked my mother, whispering her useless refrain. I wore the uniform I carried the weight of responsibility, yet somewhere inside I was still that girl on the driveway waiting for justice that never came. That day on the stage, as blood marked my dress blues, I saw the thread linking then to now. Ethan's fist was not an isolated act. It was the same shove, the same splintered door magnified under brighter lights. My father's words were not new. They were the grown version of every excuse he had ever offered. And my mother's silence was simply louder now, amplified by her failure to move, even as her daughter bled in front of her. It should have broken me. But strangely, it steadied me, because what once lived in the shadows was now out in the open. No more private denials, no more gaslighting disguised as fatherly wisdom, no more whispered peace treaties from my mother. They had revealed themselves fully publicly, and for the first time I was not alone in seeing it. I thought of the cadets who had saluted me that morning, their eyes wide now, with something closer to outrage than respect. I thought of the strangers who had lifted their phones, the professors rushing forward, the crowd holding its breath. They had all witnessed what I had carried alone for decades. The past had cracked me, yes, but in its breaking, it had also prepared me. I was not the girl on the driveway anymore. I was an officer of the United States Army standing beneath the flag, and my family's old tactics, violence, dismissal, silence no longer held the same power. In their betrayal, I saw my liberation. The past had shaped me into someone who could stand in storms, but now the storm was no longer private. It raged beneath the flag in front of hundreds of eyes. My cheek burned with every heartbeat, the copper taste of blood thick in my mouth. I could have stayed down, let the guards carry me away, disappeared into the safety of the wings. That was the role I had learned at home, endure in silence. But silence had already been shattered, and I was not willing to rebuild it for them. I pushed to my feet slowly, each movement deliberate, the weight of the hall pressing down. My vision steadied enough to find the metal lying at my boots. The ribbon was streaked red where drops had fallen, staining what was meant to symbolize honor. I bent down, picked it up with trembling fingers, and for a moment simply held it, feeling the slick of my own blood against the polished metal. The hall fell into a hush that seemed deeper than any anthem. I felt every eye on me, soldiers, officers, families, cadets still frozen in salute. My face throbbed, my jaw ached, but I forced my shoulders back and lifted the metal high. Under the flag, bruised and bloodied, I stood tall. There was a flicker in the crowd, a collective intake of breath, then a wave of murmurs. Cameras rose higher, flashes exploding. What should have been a humiliation became something else. The blood on the metal caught the light proof, etched in color no one could deny. Ethan's fist had left its mark, but in that instant, the mark became evidence. I locked eyes with my father. For the first time, his confidence faltered. His arms were still folded, his jaw still set, but his gaze broke for a second, flicking toward the sea of recording phones. He knew as well as I did this was no longer just family business. This was public record. My mother's face was pale, lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. The program she had shredded lay in her lap like the remains of her voice. She had always begged for peace, but peace was gone, replaced by the truth in pixels and frames. The security officers moved closer, hands out, but I shook my head and stepped back toward the microphone still live at the podium. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to plead. All I had to do was stand there, metal raised, blood staining my uniform. The image said everything. Whispers rippled through the audience, anger, disbelief, sympathy. "Did you get that one?" cadet muttered to another phone still recording. A professor near the aisle barked, "Every angle, don't miss this." Their urgency wasn't about me alone. It was about truth made undeniable, caught before anyone could twist it. I lowered the medal, slowly cradling it in both hands like a relic, and returned to my place at center stage. My cheek was swelling fast, the ache sharp, but my spine felt unbreakable. The hall was no longer clapping, no longer cheering. They were witnessing. Ethan shifted uneasy now, the smirk fading as he realized the story had slipped from his control. Violence thrives in shadows and private corners where excuses hold sway. But here, under lights, under flag, in front of 100 lenses, his violence had transformed into evidence. And my father's words, those 3 cold syllables, had been carried on microphones into every device in reach. He could not call them back. I thought of all the nights I had swallowed rage, telling myself endurance was survival. Yet here, survival was no longer about silence. It was about standing in full view, refusing to bow, letting the world see exactly what they had tried to bury. I held the metal against my chest, its edge pressing into bruised flesh. It hurt, but the pain steadied me. It reminded me that I was alive, still standing still, mine to define. The cameras captured every second, and I welcomed them. My blood was no longer just injury. It was ink writing the truth across their legacy. They had meant to shame me. Instead, they had given me a weapon. The moment I raised that blood-streaked metal, the story left my hands. It spread, carried by the lenses and the voices that refused to look away. By the time I walked off the stage, escorted into a side room where a medic dabbed at my swollen cheek, the evidence was already alive in 100 pockets, traveling faster than I could catch my breath. Within an hour, the videos had escaped the walls of the base. Cadets posted them with shaky captions. "This happened at our ceremony today. Reporters picked them up before the blood on my collar had dried. Screens across the country lit up with the same headline, Army Captain Assaulted During Award Ceremony by Her Own Brother." It was never supposed to leave the room, not in my father's mind. For decades, he had counted on silence to preserve our family's image. He underestimated the world we live in now, where silence shatters the moment a camera lifts. That night, I sat in my barracks with ice pressed to my cheek, my phone vibrating in endless bursts. Calls from unknown numbers, messages from classmates I hadn't seen in years, emails from journalists hungry for a statement. I answered none of them. Instead, I scrolled through the flood of strangers' voices. Some were furious, some sympathetic, some simply stunned. Who could hit their sister on stage? "She's in uniform. This is disgraceful. Get his face. Get the father's words. Don't let them bury this." I should have felt overwhelmed. Instead, I felt something close to relief. For once, the truth did not live only inside me. It had multiplied, mirrored across countless screens. By morning, the Department of Defense had issued a statement acknowledging the incident. They promised an investigation, their words careful measured, but the weight of national scrutiny was already pressing. The ceremony had been meant to showcase the Army's strength. Instead, it became a mirror for the very violence hidden within so many families. News anchors debated the footage, playing it frame by frame, the punch. The metal falling my father's lips, forming those 3 words, "You deserved it." Analysts speculated about his influence, his past service, his reputation. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was a symbol dissected by people who had never met me. And yet, as surreal as it was to watch my humiliation dissected on morning television, a strange calm settled in me. I had carried this silence for so long, convinced it was mine alone. Now it belonged to everyone. The shame was no longer mine to hold. 2 days after the ceremony, a knock came at my office door. Major Karen Hughes stood there, an officer I had respected from afar, known for her sharp mind and steady command. She closed the door behind her, her presence filling the small space with an authority I recognized. I watched the footage, she said plainly. Her voice carried no pity, only resolve. I know what it means. I tried to brush it off, instinct still pulling me towards silence. It's messy family business, ma'am. It'll pass. But she shook her head. No, this isn't just yours. What happened to you, it's what happens to too many. They're silenced, dismissed, told to endure. You stood there and refused. That's bigger than you realize. Her words sank deep. I had thought of this as my reckoning, my break from the past, but she reframed it as something collective, something carried by others too. For every woman who had been told to keep the peace, for every soldier whose bruises had been explained away, this moment had cracked something open. She leaned closer, her gaze unwavering. This isn't only your fight, Captain, it's all of ours. For the first time, I let myself believe it, that maybe the blood on my collar had written more than my own story. It had written a challenge, a refusal, a signal flare that others could follow. The storm had begun inside my family. Now it had grown into something far larger, and instead of fear, I felt steadiness. The silence I had carried my whole life had finally broken, not just for me, but for anyone who needed proof that truth once spoken cannot be silenced again. Major Hughes's words stayed with me long after she left my office. They rang louder than the noise of the media, steadier than the whirlwind of attention. This isn't only your fight. For the first time, I believed that what had been inflicted on me was no longer mine to carry in silence. But belief does not stop a family intent on reclaiming control. 3 nights later, as dusk settled over the base, a knock rattled my apartment door. Through the peephole, I saw them. My parents, my brother clustered together like a wall I had spent my whole life trying to climb. My stomach tightened, but my hand was steady as I unlocked the door. My father stepped in first, the air shifting with the weight of his authority. "Rachel," he said, tone-clipped businesslike, as if this were a debriefing, not an intrusion. "We need to talk." Behind him, Ethan loomed, jaw-tight fists flexing like he was itching to repeat what he had already done. My mother trailed last, clutching her purse strap with both hands, her eyes darting across the walls of my apartment as if searching for escape routes. I motioned them to the dining table, not out of hospitality, but strategy. I had prepared for this. On the surface of the wood, I had already laid out the evidence, screenshots from the video's printed stills of Ethan's fist connecting with my face, transcripts of my father's voice caught by multiple microphones, and a neat stack of bank statements showing every dollar I had funneled home over the years. My father's gaze landed on the papers, hardening. "You're going to take those videos down," he said flatly. "This family's name, our name, does not get dragged through the mud by one moment of poor judgment." I held his eyes, the metal from that night, resting cold against my collarbone. One moment, my voice was quiet, deliberate. "This isn't one moment. This is years, and the only mud here is what you've carried into your own hands." Ethan slammed a palm on the table, making the photos jump. "You're blowing this out of proportion, Rachel. You always have." His voice had that same sneer I'd grown up with, the one that turned every wound into my fault. I leaned forward, pressing a finger to the image of his fist, frozen mid-swing. Proportion is exactly what this is. For once, the world sees the full scale of it, and you don't get to redefine it anymore. My father's straightened voice rising. "We are the Donovans. We do not air our failures to strangers. You will end this now." I stood my chair, scraping the floor, and laid my hand over the stack of bank records. "You've already aired them on a stage under a flag in front of hundreds, and you taught me something that day. That true honor doesn't hide. It stands in the open." For a breath, silence hung heavy. My mother's lips trembled as if she might intervene, but she swallowed the words back just as she always had. Ethan, red-faced, shoved his chair back, rising to his feet, shoulders squared as if ready to strike again. But this time he didn't reach me. A beam of light cut across the room, bright and blinding. 2 military police officers stepped into the doorway, summoned by the security protocols I had quietly arranged before letting my family in. Their flashlights swept over Ethan, their hands firm on their holstered weapons. "Sir, step back," one of them ordered. Ethan froze, caught between rage and the sudden reminder that outside these walls his violence carried consequences. My father's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. My mother shrank further into herself, whispering a prayer I couldn't hear. I turned to the officers, my voice steady. "It's fine. They were just leaving." The MPs held their ground until Ethan backed away, muttering curses under his breath, and my parents followed the 3 of them, retreating like a tide that had tried to swallow me one last time. When the door shut behind them, the silence that filled the apartment was different. It wasn't the silence of fear or the silence my mother had always begged for. It was the silence of space reclaimed. I gathered the papers back into their folder, each page a record of truth no longer hidden. Their threats had always depended on my silence. Now they had nothing left to wield. For the first time, I wasn't standing against them alone. The evidence, the witnesses, the world outside these walls, they stood with me. And I realized with sharp clarity the Donovan's name was no longer mine to protect. My honor was. The night my family left my apartment under the watch of the MPs, I knew the battle had shifted from private confrontation to public reckoning. Evidence was no longer just scattered across phones and whispers. It was organized, undeniable, and waiting for its place under oath. When the summons came for the court-martial hearing, I didn't flinch. For once, I wasn't the one on trial. The military courthouse was stark stripped of ornament, the kind of place where truth had no shadows to hide in. Rows of uniforms filled the benches, their decorations catching the sterile light. At the front, the flag stood tall, unyielding, a silent witness to the proceedings. My breath steadied as I entered the medal from that day pinned once more to my chest, not as an honor, but as a reminder of what had been stained. Ethan sat at the defense table, shoulders tense, jaw set in the same defiance that had marked his every step through life. My father sat beside him, his bearing still rigid with the posture of a colonel, though stripped now of authority. My mother was absent, tucked away in her silence. For once, her absence said more than her presence ever had. The prosecutor began with the videos. Angle after angle played across the screens, the punch caught mid-arc, my body collapsing, the metal clattering my father's face, leaning close. Then the audio, his voice crisp and cold, echoing through the speakers. "You deserved it." The courtroom did not move. Even the shuffle of papers stilled. Hearing it in replay was like being struck again, but this time the blow fell on everyone in the room. No one could dismiss it as exaggeration. No one could soften it with excuses. It was there, recorded, undeniable. When it was my turn to speak, I rose, my uniform crisp, my cheek still marked faintly by the scar. I told them about the driveway at 9 years old, about the door, splintered at 14, about every bruise explained away as temper, every silence excused as keeping peace. I painted the picture not with rage, but with precision dates, moments, words that had clung to me like weights. The room was silent. Not the restless silence of boredom, but the heavy stillness of listening, of bearing witness. Faces that had been blank turned solemn, some shifting with discomfort, others with anger. For once, my voice was not competing against theirs. It carried unbroken across the room. Ethan's lawyer tried to paint it as a family dispute, emotions running high. But the videos undercut every word. The images spoke louder than excuses, and the audio sealed it. My father was called to the stand, his testimony sharp with defensiveness. He spoke of discipline, of keeping order, of moments misinterpreted. But when cross-examination replayed his words again, "You deserved it," his arguments fell apart. The silence that followed was more damning than any rebuttal. Witnesses came forward, professors, cadets, officers, each recounting what they had seen and heard that day. Their voices formed a chorus, harmonizing into one undeniable truth. I sat and listened, no longer alone in memory. The pattern I had carried in my chest was laid out for all to see. When the verdict came, it was not with drama or spectacle. It was with quiet finality. Ethan was found guilty of assault. The sentence: community service, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order that barred him from ever approaching me again. My father was charged with abetting his reputation as a decorated colonel, tarnished with the official mark of complicity. The name Donovan, once spoken with reverence in military circles, now carried a stain. It was not the end of the world, but it was the end of the lie. As I left the courthouse, reporters clustered outside, cameras flashing. I did not stop to speak. The verdict itself was enough. The truth was already louder than anything I could say. Walking past the rows of uniforms, I felt lighter, not because justice had erased the past, but because it had named it, carved it into the record where denial could not reach. For the first time, the silence was not mine to carry. It was theirs. The courthouse doors closed behind me with the weight of finality, but what followed was not silence. It was renewal. The verdict had stripped away the illusions I had carried since childhood, and though the scars on my face were fading, the deeper wound had finally begun to heal. I was no longer defined by the storm my family had unleashed. I was defined by the way I had stood through it. Weeks later, an invitation came. The commanding officer at the academy asked if I would speak to a new class of cadets, young men and women just beginning the journey I had once walked, their uniforms still stiff, their confidence untested. For a moment, I hesitated. My story had already been dissected by strangers, broadcast across headlines. But this was different. This was not about cameras or courts. This was about handing down truth to those who still had time to carry it differently. When I stood before them, rows of fresh faces under the sharp lines of the flag, I felt the same pulse of nerves I had felt the day of the ceremony. Only this time, the stage was mine by choice. I looked into their eyes and saw eagerness, uncertainty, hope. They deserved honesty, more than polished words. On the day I was supposed to be honored, I began my voice steady. My family tried to strip me of dignity in front of the world. They thought shame could silence me. But what they did not understand was this: sometimes the very moment they mean to break you becomes the moment you break free. A quiet fell across the hall, the kind of silence that listens. I told them not only of the punch and the words that followed, but of the years before it, how silence had been demanded of me, how loyalty had been twisted into submission. I told them what it had cost to carry those secrets and what it had given me to finally let them go. Honor, I said, is not the absence of shame. It is the refusal to hide truth, no matter how painful. The day they tried to humiliate me was the day I found freedom. Because truth once spoken cannot be taken back. I saw some of them shift their expressions sober. Perhaps they thought of their own families, their own quiet battles. Perhaps they simply understood that the uniform does not protect you from scars, but it does give you the chance to stand taller in spite of them. When the speech ended, the applause was not thunderous, but steady, heartfelt. A few cadets lingered, approaching me quietly afterward. One whispered, "Thank you for saying it out loud." Another simply saluted, his hand trembling, but his gaze firm. Later, in the mirror of my quarters, I studied my reflection. The faint mark on my cheekbone was still visible, a reminder carved into skin, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a testament. I adjusted the collar of my uniform, the fabric pressing gently against that scar. In my eyes, I did not see the girl who had once been told to stay silent. I saw the woman who had chosen to speak, who had turned blood into proof, humiliation into strength. The Donovan's name might have fallen into disgrace, but I had risen from it not as their daughter, not as their scapegoat, but as myself. And as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the flag rippling above me, I understood the truest freedom is not given by ceremony or medal. It is claimed in the moment you refuse to be silenced. That day on stage had been meant to end me. Instead, it had remade me. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share how you feel in the comments below. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Your voice matters here, and your perspective might inspire someone else reading. Don't forget to subscribe to Family Story Corner so you won't miss the next story that could stay with you long after it ends.